I really hope none of you are surprised when I make this incredibly bold proclamation that there is life on planet Earth. Well, you might be saying, no, duh, or something similar. And you would be right. However, before we really get into life on planet Earth, we need to talk about Earth first, and some of the conditions that allow it to sustain life. Well, we know that Earth has an atmosphere that is not too thick, not like Venus, which has a runaway greenhouse effect, nor too thin like Mars. Earth has an atmosphere that is about 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other gases, mostly argon, but with a growing percentage of carbon dioxide. This layer of gases does a lot of things. First of all, it circulates heat between the equator and the poles, so it helps moderate temperature gradients. And it keeps a lot of the heat in. Greenhouse effect is not a bad thing, in a sense. Global warming is what prevents Earth's average surface temperature from being negative 18 degrees Celsius as opposed to its current plus 15 to 16 degrees Celsius. What does this mean? This means that without global warming, Earth would be an ice ball. In fact, there have been periods in Earth's history, geologic history, where, according to geological evidence, due to carbon dioxide level drops in the atmosphere, due to the advent of photosynthesis, it turns out that Earth was in fact covered by ice, for the most part. And then, well, these periods lasted for many millions of years, and only volcanism, i.e. volcanic eruptions, managed to add enough greenhouse gas to eventually melt the ice. Why is this the case? Well, we know that ice is much more reflective than open water, which means that once the ice ball started to happen, snowball Earth they call it, once this began to happen, the ice caps just kept spreading until it was pretty much the entire planet, except perhaps a band across the equator, a slush ball Earth, so to speak, was covered. Then, well, after that, once the ice started to melt and the area of surface water, of open water, which is very high in absorbance of sunlight, especially the heat aspect, once that began to grow, the polar caps receded quite rapidly. So, the ice is of course part of the hydrosphere, which is all water on Earth. In vapor, i.e. clouds, for example, or just water vapor in general in the air. And by the way, water vapor is one of the most important greenhouse gases. And yes, I do realize that this sounds kind of weird when you think of a snowball Earth scenario, given shouldn't the atmosphere be full of water vapor if the whole surface, or almost all of it, is covered by ice? Well, the lower the temperature, the lower the amount of water that exists in vapor form. This is why when you lower the temperature by forcing a cloud to go up a mountain, it rains or snows. That's because the water just falls out, pretty much. It can no longer hold the water. And of course, the mountains that I just used are part of the lithosphere. This is essentially the outer layer of Earth. So pretty much the crust. Sometimes you add a little bit of upper mantle in there. And, well, it's sometimes mixed in with the hydrosphere. Why do we know this? Well, for that matter, it's sometimes mixed in with the atmosphere too, depending on what your idea of sand it looks like. We know that the lithosphere and the hydrosphere overlap because when we drill down to make a well, we can get water. That means there's water underground. So the lithosphere is not so solid after all, which by the way is why the biosphere can penetrate into it fairly easily. I mean fairly easily in terms of they have found living bacteria and archaea many tens of kilometers under the surface of the Earth, living in rocks. The biosphere is typically defined as where life can exist. Other cases, particularly in other nations, the biosphere may be described as all life and the products of life. Why are these considered okay for both being used for one term? It's because currently, pretty much anywhere where life can survive on Earth has life in it. That's why these two definitions are not completely incompatible. So the biosphere is mixed in with the other spheres. You might think, hey, the biosphere overlaps completely with the hydrosphere. For the most part, you would be right. Why? Because Earth life is carbon water based. And so it depends on having water to live. Some people, however, decide that, well, I mean, what's the point of saying biosphere as a full sphere if it's going to completely overlap with the hydrosphere? Well, some people describe the hydrosphere as not including the water in certain organisms, such as the fungal spores that you can find hundreds of kilometers up into the atmosphere. At altitudes of over 100 kilometers, they have managed to collect blowing fungal spores. This is much less obvious than the dandelion seeds you see flying past you in the atmosphere semi-regularly if you live in North America. As a side note, and you might find this interesting, it has been estimated by genetic studies that in all of northeastern North America, there are exactly 3 actual dandelion plants. Dandelion flowers currently in eastern North America, they do not need to be fertilized. They do not actually get fertilized. All the seeds that you see are not actually seeds. They are, well, embryos. They are technically embryos, but they are clones of the parent plant. They do not contain any sexual reproduction. There is no crossing over. There is no recombination. It's just clonal reproduction. Fortunately, it seems dandelions are fairly tough plants. And so, well, fortunately for them, dandelions seem to be fairly tough plants, which means that there hasn't been a virus that suddenly kills off all the dandelions in eastern North America yet. Why? Because if they're clones, then other than mutations, they should be genetically the same, and therefore genetically roughly equally vulnerable to any disease. Well, no, that's not me trying to give you an idea as to how to deal with dandelions. In fact, if we release a virus to kill dandelions, chances are it's going to affect something else too, which would be bad. So careful study would be required before any consideration of such a thing. And besides, dandelions, well, they don't really hurt anything, except for maybe the appearance, I guess, of your lawn if you really don't like little yellow flowers. Well, whatever. So here's an image that shows how the biosphere is within all 3 spheres, and how the spheres do overlap with each other. So, for the most part, life does not actually live in most solid rocks. You require pore spaces, or cracks, as demonstrated here by the roots of this plant, or this tree, in this case. Now, given how interconnected these things are, it was perhaps inevitable that sometime, in this case in the 1960s, some person, well, James Lovelock in this case, decided to come up with the idea of, hey, if Earth is also interconnected, and it seems to regulate itself more or less, hey, maybe it's one big organism, almost. Now, this isn't completely unreasonable, given that even in organisms, every cell is struggling for its own genetic survival, which, by the way, is why we have people getting cancer, because those cells essentially prioritize their own genetic survival in the short term over their genetic survival in the long term, as in the survival and reproduction of the organism as a whole. So perhaps humans can be seen as a cancer upon the earth. An ominous thought, given what usually happens. Well, what usually happens to either the cancer cells or the organism. So, the concept of the Jaya hypothesis is not exactly scientifically accepted, but it is culturally very valuable. Why is it culturally very valuable to see the Earth as one big interconnected organism? Because if we see that we are all one, then we are more inclined to take good care of the world. Think about why cultural evolution is important. Well, cultural evolution has given humanity basically everything in recorded human history, or in human history in general. Biological evolution for mankind basically stopped when humans became anatomically modern, for the most part, because our cultural evolution became so fast compared to our biological evolution that cultural evolution completely dominated. So, it was cultural evolution that prevented us from nuking ourselves off the face of this planet during the Cold War. Eventually, when people were busy trying to intimidate each other, they finally realized, well, we can't actually have a fight. Why? We all want to live. So that's actually a big cultural realization. Perhaps the Jaya hypothesis will be similar in value as a cultural realization that we are all on spaceship Earth in the same boat. If we want to live, we better treat spaceship Earth properly. Now, in summary, the atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. It moderates Earth's surface temperatures and also carries a hydrosphere and lithosphere around, as you probably have noticed when it rains far away from a body of water, and when there's a sandstorm, or when dust blows at you, for that matter. It also blocks some of the incoming cosmic rays. Obviously, it does not block all cosmic rays. Why? Because we can see sunlight. And thermal energy, heat. Heat reaches the surface of the Earth. It does, however, block ultraviolet rays and most harmful cosmic rays, which is great. Please note, though, that it doesn't block them completely. This is why you can still get sunburned if you expose yourself to the sun for too long. And sunscreens, for that matter, also don't block them completely. If you want to be actually ultraviolet proof, you should probably live under a mirror. Although that's not very smart in general. Now, the lithosphere. Well, sticks and stones? No, sticks are biosphere. Stones. Well, there's a reason it's litho. Lithograph, lithosphere, stones. So, it's pretty much the solid crust of the Earth. And that's it. It's not very complicated. Now, the composition of the lithosphere clearly varies from location to location. For example, if you go and stand out on a beach, the sand, that's mostly silica, mostly quartz. If you look at the ocean floor, that's mostly mafic rock, which means that much more of it is going to be iron compared to silicates, or at least, if not iron, other metals. It is denser, and that, by the way, is part of why it's mafic. Mafic is defined as silica content that's relatively low. Ultramafic rock is really old oceanic crust, and it has even lower silica content, but that's not really existent anymore in terms of the magma that actually reaches the Earth's surface and becomes lava. So the hydrosphere is Earth's water in all its forms. So for example, there, I just added a little bit to the hydrosphere because the gas that came out of my lungs is pretty much saturated in water, whereas the gas that went in was not. The biosphere is where life exists, or alternatively, all life and its products, because these are pretty much the same concept at present. Anywhere that life can exist will be colonized by life very quickly, at least in geologic terms, for the most part. I mean, clearly, if there's a rocky inclusion that forms somewhere deep under the Earth's crust, or deep within the Earth's crust, it might take a while for life to manage to infiltrate there, or otherwise reach it. The Gaia hypothesis proposes that Earth behaves like a living organism. This is scientifically not exactly valid, but it's culturally very useful, hence the Canadian curriculum sees fit to include it. Well, hopefully today was enlightening, and we'll see you next time.